Welcome to Working for Women, the Independent Women's Forum podcast, where we are changing the conversation about women and public policy for the better.
Hi, my name is Patrice Terrific, and I'm a senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. Last night, President Donald Trump held a primetime press conference to announce his nominee to replace retiring Supreme Court Judge Anthony Kennedy. After 2 weeks of speculation, Judge Brett Kavanaugh was announced. This sprightly 53-year-old judge, law professor, and father of two girls now enters what promises to be a rancorous road to the confirmation. Here today to tell us more about Judge Kavanaugh is Erin Hawley, our IWF Legal Fellow. Erin is also an associate law professor at the University of Missouri. She has worked in private practice for the Justice Department, and she's clerked for Chief Justice John Roberts. Erin, welcome back to the program.
So happy to be here. Thanks, Patrice.
Terrific. Well, I was on the edge of my seat watching last night's announcement, and we heard and saw that it's Judge Kavanaugh. So tell us about Judge Kavanaugh and what makes him such a great pick for the Supreme Court.
Absolutely. Well, I was on the edge of my seat as well, Patrice, and really thrilled when the president nominated Judge Kavanaugh. As President Trump said, he's really a judge's judge. Judge Kavanaugh is currently a judge on the D.C. Court of Appeals, the D.C. Circuit, and this is sort of known as sort of the field team, the training team, as it were, for the Supreme Court. So a highly respected court, and on that court, Judge Kavanaugh himself is extremely well regarded. He's a graduate of Yale Law School, he's a graduate of Yale College, and a former law clerk to Justice Kennedy, whom he would replace. He's also taught hundreds of students, mostly at Harvard Law School, and ironically, kind of fortuitously, was hired by then Dean Elena Kagan, who will hopefully be his colleague in the near future. Most importantly, Patrice, though, I think Judge Kavanaugh is a great pick because he fulfills the president's pledge to appoint a judge who respects the Constitution. In his speech last night, he said that he believes that the Constitution and its structural provisions are designed to preserve the blessings of liberty. And he explained what he called a straightforward judicial philosophy, that a judge must be independent, a judge must interpret the law and not make it. He's committed to textualism, the rather novel idea that a judge must interpret statutes as written. One would think that might be obvious, and also to originalism. And this is the theory that really constrains and limits unelected judges because originalism requires them, as Judge Kavanaugh explained it, to interpret the Constitution as written, also informed by history, tradition, and precedent. So this binds them to those sorts of categories rather than looking to their own value judgment. So I think he's a wonderful pick.
I agree with you. And, one of the quotes that stood out to me is he may have written it in a previous opinion or elsewhere, but that he believes that the court should be about, not shying away from the rights that people have, but also not creating new rights. And I think that goes to the quote that you pulled out, where he talks about that judges should interpret the law, not make law. So, I think Americans should really be excited that we have a Supreme Court justice who's not going to try to, enact social policy, but really look at the Constitution and interpret it as it was written. But beyond him just being a judge, there is a personal side to him. And I don't know if you caught it, but I had to tweet an image of him wiping a tear as he was talking about his family and giving his youngest daughter a side high five. So there's definitely another side to him. And I would love for you to talk a little bit more about his personal story.
I love that too, Patrice, and it was really heartwarming, as you say. Listeners should go back and watch Judge Kavanaugh's speech. I think you'll learn a lot about the way he looks at judging, but also, as you said, just about the man behind the resume. And a really sort of poignant moment was when he was describing his youngest daughter. Both of his daughters are basketball players, and he is their coach for their Catholic league. And he described them both as wonderful basketball players. His eldest daughter, I think, is an avid reader, he said, and his youngest daughter likes to talk a lot. And then he followed that with a high five to his smiling youngest daughter. Really a warm moment. So Judge Kavanaugh is clearly a family man, someone who values his wife and his children very much. And he also has his own sort of personal story. that he told his mom. He's the son of 2 lawyers, which might not be that surprising, but it's very surprising in the way that this sort of came about. His mom was a public school teacher in the Washington, D.C. high schools, primarily African-American schools, and taught history for a number of years. When Judge Kavanaugh was 10 years old, she attended law school and later became a judge in D.C. So he said that when he hears Judge Kavanaugh, he still thinks that someone's talking about his mom. His dad worked full-time and attended law school at night. And Judge Kavanaugh described the wonderful work ethic that he'd seen from his father and said that that's something that he has attempted to emulate his entire professional life. So it's a really wonderful story. He also has a priest that he had served as an altar boy, was at his acceptance speech last night, and talked about how he grew up learning from this man and then now helps him serve meals to the homeless. So someone that's very involved and invested in his family and his community.
Yeah, I think those are all great examples that show, a different side of him. And not that you have to select a Supreme Court justice based on his personal story, but I think members of Congress are going to be looking for, the other sides of the judge and how he can, view both the law, but also the situation surrounding law. So I think it's very good to see the whole picture of Judge Kavanaugh. But he has definitely a long resume, and he served for about a dozen years on the bench. Are there 1 or 2 opinions that you think really stand out? Things that Americans should really take, be pleased about, or understand how he's going to bring his jurisprudence, his background to how he would judge?
Absolutely, and it's tough to pick just a couple because, as you mentioned, he's been on the federal bench for about 12 years, and in that time issued something upwards of 300 opinions. So been a very active judge who's demonstrated his commitment to the Constitution time and time again. So he's got a long record, a record that should be heartening to people who believe in the rule of law. And to just pull a couple of cases, there's one in particular in Priest for Life versus HHS. And in that case, Judge Kavanaugh dissented from the majority ruling. And in his view, it was unconstitutional. In his view, it violated RFRA, the Religious Freedom and Restoration Act, to require religious organizations like the Little Sisters of the Poor or Priest for Life to facilitate employee access to contraceptives because that violated their deeply held religious belief. He was in the minority in the D.C. Circuit, but that opinion and his views were later upheld at the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision where the court held, indeed, in a case called Zubik, that the government could not force religious organizations, to provide contraceptives or facilitate the acquisition of contraceptions if that violated their religious belief. And in that opinion, Judge Kavanaugh really sort of drilled down on the importance of religious liberty. And he criticized the panel majority for judicially second-guessing the correctness or reasonableness of plaintiff's religion. And I think this is so important. In our country, the Free Exercise Clause guarantees us a right to practice our religion, regardless of whether those in power think it's a good one or not. So it's a very, very important point there. Another sort of area of law that Judge Kavanaugh has been particularly active and I think particularly good on is dealing with the administrative state and administrative agencies. He has pushed back, I believe the Wall Street Journal reported 40 times he has found agency actions to be unlawful, which is really something because the Supreme Court often defers to agency actions. And in one of those cases, Coalition for Responsible Regulation versus the EPA, Judge Kavanaugh argued, again in dissent, but again upheld at the Supreme Court, that the Obama administration's EPA had massively burdensome greenhouse gas regulations that were not supported by the statute, the Clean Air Act. Again, Justice Scalia, writing to the majority, upheld his view, and Judge Kavanaugh had some really sort of, I think, important things to say. He wrote that an agency cannot adopt absurd or otherwise unreasonable interpretations of statutory provisions, and that courts should not lightly conclude that Congress intended to impose enormous costs on tens of thousands of American businesses with corresponding effects on American jobs and workers without being clear in the statute. And this area of law, I think, is something that we may see changed at the Supreme Court in the near future. And it's sort of an area that's known as Chevron deference. And this was a case in the 1980s that requires federal courts to defer to agencies' interpretations of federal law unless they're unreasonable. And in speeches and in his opinions, Judge Kavanaugh has been good to sort of hold agencies to the text of the statutes while still maintaining sort of faithfulness to the Supreme Court precedent.
So what I hear you saying is, even if he's been provided dissenting opinions from the final ruling, his dissenting opinions have been upheld by the Supreme Court, which means that he was probably right all along. And I think that we should really find some confidence in that. I think that's great. Now, of course, this is probably going to be a tumultuous road to him joining the Supreme Court. What are you? The left has already painted a narrative that that this is going to be the death of women, that he's going to roll back rights, abortion rights, affirmative action rights, gay marriage. I mean, do you agree, or is this just fear mongering?
Absolutely not. I think that sort of fear-mongering is really ridiculous for one primary reason. I think that appointing justices or judges who hopefully will become justices like Judge Kavanaugh will actually lead to increased freedoms for women and all Americans. And for this reason, Judge Kavanaugh believes in judicial humility in that he believes the judiciary has a narrowly confined role as described by the Constitution. So he believes that the Constitution and the structures are designed to preserve individual liberty, like I mentioned earlier. And part of that is the checks and balances and division of authority of federal powers in that Constitution. And the judiciary has a limited role, as he said last night, is to interpret, not to make the law. And when the judiciary stays within that limited role, then that opens up a lot more opportunity for the American people to actually govern themselves through their elected representatives, because the Supreme Court is not taking those issues off the table. So I believe that actually appointing justices like Judge Kavanaugh will increase freedoms for all Americans rather than take them away.
That's great. And I hope that our listeners out there are listening very keenly to your analysis, because what we're going to hear is going to be a lot of the exact opposite. So as we're wrapping this up, I would love for you to give us a timeline. What can we expect over the next few months? And when are things expected to happen? Because I'm pretty sure that by the fall, the Supreme Court will be seated again for its next session. So please talk us through the timeline.
Absolutely. So Judge Kavanaugh, no rest for the weary. After the sort of confirmation process with President Trump, he started meeting today with senators on the Hill. He will likely meet with all 100 of them, certainly with all 100 of their staff, to talk about sort of his role, how he views judging, his judicial philosophy, those sorts of things. At the same time, he will be working on a questionnaire that's sent out by the Senate Judiciary Committee. And this will be one area where Judge Kavanaugh will have, I think someone has said, upwards of 1 million pages of documents that the Judiciary Committee will look through. So a lot of material and record to look through. Judge Kavanaugh will also be reviewing that for the upcoming Senate Judiciary Committee hearings. Hopefully those will be scheduled sometime in August or September, and then the committee will vote and then hopefully refer him out to the full floor. And as you mentioned, it's really critical that the Senate act in a timely manner so that he can be sitting on the bench the first week of October when the court opens for its October 2018 session.
Erin, that's a perfect timeline. I know that the Senate is going to actually be in session for most of August. Their recess has been canceled, and for good reason. They have a lot of work to do, and one of those things is going to be confirming Judge Kavanaugh. So thank you for giving us the rundown of this SCOTUS nominee and what we can expect in the months to come. To our listeners, thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to like us and rate us on iTunes so that others can discover our conversations. And visit IWF for more analysis about the Supreme Court, politics, pop culture, and policy. We hope you'll tune in again.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please give it a thumbs up, share it on social media, or Stop by IWF.org for similar content.